Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on U.S. and Canadian immigration options post-U.S. election. As we process the results of the U.S. presidential and congressional elections, we recognize that both employers and individuals have questions about the future of immigration benefits and policy. Today, we're fortunate to have two esteemed experts from Green & Spiegel with us. Evan Green is one of the two managing partners at Green & Spiegel and is certified as a specialist in immigration law by the Law Society of Ontario. Evan is called to the bar in both Canada and the United States and is able to practice federal immigration law in both countries. Evan has been practicing immigration law for over 30 years and has extensive experience in all areas of Canadian immigration. And today we are also joined by Jonathan Grode, who is the U.S. Practice Director and Managing Partner for Green & Spiegel. Jonathan has worked continuously in the U.S. business immigration law field since 1999 and has amassed a considerable experience of obtaining non-immigrant and immigrant visas. Jonathan also has significant experience dealing with Department of Labor and Department of Homeland Security enforcement actions, as well as immigration-related aspects of mergers and acquisitions. So throughout the session, our speakers will provide insights and address your most frequently asked questions regarding cross-border immigration policies and opportunities. We'll also have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to leave your questions in the chat. And now, without further ado, let's get started. Please join me in welcoming speakers Evan and Jonathan.
Thanks, Eve.
Thanks, Eve.
So we had an election in the United States, and we have a Back to the Future situation where we are going to have Trump 2. So, Jonathan, what do you think we can expect in our Back to the Future situation?
From a level perspective, Evan, I mean, I think you stated it well. It is a situation where we kind of know what we're getting. We've seen Trump before, we've seen the play. I think fundamentally, a lot of it is about show of power and less about results in, sorry, there's some chats going in about the sound quality. I think we're okay. I just want to make sure everybody's all right.
I hear you just fine.
Okay. Sound is fine. Okay, great. Thank you, Nicole. Appreciate that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you guys are awesome. Look at this. And if you want to ask questions, I do keep an eye on the chat. I can try to take a look at that as we're talking. But Evan, is what I was saying is like, you know, when we had Trump the first time around, a lot of the play was about the foreign nationals of Muslim descent coming into the United States. And what do we see on day one? We saw this ban. We saw this Muslim ban come into effect. It was done for dramatic purposes. It was done with an idea of saying, here's a new person in town, and I am going to be fulfilling a promise that I made to you. I think we're going to be seeing a lot of the same sort of thing. Already there's discussions about them talking about actions within the United States as it relates to people without status. Even though deportation is not actually the correct terminology, that's what they're using. They're talking about this mass deportation effort. All the way through to the specter of using the National Guards as a means of controlling and investigating people that don't have status. There's potential of engaging in state law enforcement agency to execute some of these efforts on immigration and customs enforcement. How much of that is actually going to come to fruition? I think we'll see a certain aspect of it. I think the administration is square on making that impression. And I think that we're going to see something similar to what we saw the first time around. Will that really impact individuals here who are engaging in employment, Evan? I think they're going to have a much lighter touch on legal immigration overall than what we saw during the first administration, when we can unpack that a little bit. I think those in employment status saw a lot of challenges with respect to adjudication trends, wait times, and delays. I think some of that is going to come into effect, but I don't see us really experiencing heavy policy that is going to try to undercut the legal system for immigrating to the United States. The best analogy that I can give you is I think they're going to be having the referees blow the whistle more often. You know, if we want to use a sports analogy, I don't think we're going to see fundamental rule changes, But a case that might have gone through without a request for evidence is probably going to get a request for evidence.
We
A
saw that last
situation,
time too.
yeah, exactly. A situation where the interview was waived, you're going to have an interview. The appointment times to get your visa stamped are going to increase.
Well, how's that even possible?
Well, I know the Canadian situation is like almost laughable in some circumstances, but around the world, the visa appoint times have, shrunken tremendously. So I do see a lot of this, and I want to save some time to talk about worksite enforcement, visa processing, and those kinds of things. But I think a lot of the focus fundamentally is going to be on the southern border and not the northern border. I think we might see something as draconian as a shutdown of passenger operations along the southern border.
Meaning what? What does that mean?
Meaning that only cargo and goods will enter the United States. If you're here on a work visa, you're going to have to fly in from Mexico as opposed to being able to drive across.
COVID
Um,
2.0.
Yeah, something to that effect. And obviously they'll have their favorites and their exceptions and whatnot. Jillian raises something interesting here. And Evan, I don't know if you saw the latest chatter that came out this week, but there's actually going to be a push for denaturalization, which is something we've never seen before, but essentially them revisiting people's citizenship filings, the way they got their green cards to see if they can take away citizenship. Jillian, I would say that, that makes a nice headline, but it is a very hard thing to do from a legal mechanism. It's something that would require a lot of court proceedings. So I wouldn't, again.
Like you're looking at the numbers, right? And I heard something like 11 million undocumented aliens they're looking at removing, which just sounds ridiculous and would cost $1 trillion, which is what they spend, apparently, the United States spends on defense. So the numbers are just astronomical, both in people as well as costs. So
well, and not to
where is this
mention
all
the
getting
effects,
funded from, right?
and not to mention like the impacts to labor and employment and the job market. I mean, it's funny. It's there. I think there. And I was watching an interview last night with some, Trump voters, and they were like, "We're not against legal immigration. We think these people should leave, and then they can come back." And I think there's just a misperception, generally speaking, as to like how these things function. Logistically, to your point, I mean, unless you are going to go like heavy military with some level of camps at like army bases and like some really, really, really heavy stuff that would be extremely expensive,
Yeah.
the effect will be targeted more on individuals that have criminal pasts.
Well, it makes perfect sense. Like,
Yeah.
I'm a Canadian. I wouldn't want illegal criminals in my country either.
Right. It's going to be focused on that. I think the other situation where you're going to see it heavily impacted is those who encounter law enforcement for other reasons will be referred to Immigration and Customs Enforcement for removal. I think if you have a denial, let's say on like a marriage-based case, Evan, that will be referred to an immigration judge for removal. The sort of discretion for non-criminals that encounter the system where they've decided to not take action, they will start taking action. I think that that's going to be like the big trend.
That? Like, my question would be, how are they going to do that given the numbers, given the cost? I mean, are they hiring? Where are they going to find the people to do all this?
Well, and that's where I think the idea of engaging the National Guard is sort of the Project 2025 plan. Like they want to make this more of a military activity than a law enforcement activity. Again, you're 100% right. The cost component of it, the effects of it are so astronomical and even logistically challenging that there'll be enough of it to get the headlines out there to make the impression on the population. Just logistically speaking, it is near impossible
Right.
At least within like the initial part of the Trump administration. It is certainly not going to happen overnight. But there are things they can do overnight. And that's where like shutting the border in and showing these sorts of like force of strength can be a problem. The other area, which, I think is fascinating, is a lot of the people that work for the government are concerned. So we might see a changeover in personnel. I mean, there is talk of sort of this purging, like really draining the swamp, right? And trying to get rid of some of these legacy individuals at Department of State, USCIS, the adjudicators, and that kind of thing. And we could see some of that as well. And that will affect like the day-to-day trends, sort of that whistle blowing on the refereeing that we were talking about. Afnan here on the Q&A, Evan asks a very specific question, but one that I think is on a lot of people's minds, and it's a little nuanced, but worth discussing, which is, I'm wondering if the H-4 EAD program will be impacted. The H-4 EAD program allows for, people that have long waits on green cards, mostly Indian foreign nationals, to allow their spouses to obtain employment authorization. Afnan, it certainly could be something that is affected, but that's a regulation, uh, which would require them to engage in a rulemaking procedure. So there's a number of like legal hoops they would have to jump through before that would be effectuated, and you would have substantial notice before something like that comes into effect. And Evan, I think this goes to a lot of like where the fear is. I mean, Trump has a mandate this time, like a real mandate. He has both houses of Congress. He has a judiciary, and he has the popular vote. But we still have laws and procedures within the United States that are deeply embedded in society that are just not going to disappear overnight, despite what the rhetoric might be. And I think a lot of the reason why we're having this webinar today and why we're doing so much outreach is to kind of separate the myth from the reality on what's going to occur. And that H-4 EAD is a good example.
No, it's certainly, I mean, from the Canadian context, one of the things the Canadian government is worried about is people that have TPS making their way to the border and trying to get across into Canada. Okay. It's certainly an issue, certainly an issue. Worksite enforcement. What are your thoughts?
I think worksite enforcement is going to be a huge thing moving forward.
Meaning what?
So one of the best ways to find people that don't have status is to go to work sites that traditionally employ people without status and do what's known as an immigration raid. And an immigration raid is essentially where you show up at a work site with no information, no advance notice or no advance warning, and you essentially check the documentation of all the individuals that are there on the work site to see if they're legally present in the United States with authorization to work. This is different from an I-9 audit, which is more of like a paper functionality. This is actually people showing up at the work site. Believe it or not, we haven't really seen these raids, and this is, I think, is aging both of us a little bit, but we haven't really seen these raids since since the second Bush administration.
Interesting.
Like that's how long it's been. Even under the Trump administration, there wasn't a lot of raid activity the first time around. And I think Ulrich raises in the chat this like nice comment, which is, I don't want us to underestimate the Trump agenda. Remember, they came back with more experience and have all parts of the government under their control. And this is one of them. So, historically speaking, and we've seen this playbook before, but the meatpacking industry in particular was a heavy target of the George W. Bush administration. I think we're going to see it at some of these.
Didn't people go to jail that Trump pardoned afterwards from the meatpacking industry? I remember that.
There's a little bit of that.
Yes.
I think, the Trump administration on worksite enforcement previously was heavily targeting smaller businesses. These like little construction businesses and that kind of thing. I think this time we're going to see larger employers targeted and very specific to certain industries. Interestingly enough, I'm going to be curious to see where these activities occur. So for example, like, believe it or not, Alabama has one of the largest chicken producing facilities, I think, in the United States, if not the world. that's an occupation within the poultry industry that tends to attract people without status. But is he going to engage in a behavior that will affect the economy of a loyalist state? Or is he going to go to Illinois, which was voted Democratic, where they have these meatpacking facilities, and target those because of their political leanings? And I think Trump, as you can see through some of the appointments that they're putting in place, is really engaging in almost like a loyalty test with some of these appointments. And I think that could permeate through to the decision as to where to engage in these enforcement activities. For example, Philadelphia, where our U.S. headquarters is at, is a sanctuary city. During the last Trump administration, there was heavy push to defund federal funding of the municipality because of the sanctuary city status. And for those of you that aren't familiar with sanctuary city, it's essentially a city where the municipal law enforcement will not refer or engage in discussing status of foreign nationals with immigration and customs enforcement on a federal level. So
Right.
I think it's going to be interesting to see where these activities are targeted.
I just think that the numbers are so huge, and the manpower required to perform worksite enforcement. How many people? I mean, it'll happen, right? But it can't be completely widespread because there just isn't the enforcement capability.
I mean, look, let's be realistic about this. It's the announcement of mass deportation is an effort to get people to stop coming to the border now, and an effort to have people who are here without status to leave. Okay, worksite enforcement is going to be a mechanism to show employers that, if you have people without status, you better get your ducks in a row and have your I-9 documentation correctly and engage in serious discussions over sponsorship. I think a lot of these behaviors are to control, a lot of these actions are to control future behavior. It is like the deterrent motivation. It also is to show control and power within the federal government. But your point is very well taken, which is the size and scope of the people in the United States without status is massive. 10 to 11 million is conservative. That's been the number that's been bandied around for almost 20 years. In reality, it's probably much higher.
Are they talking about DACA?
DACA is a tricky kind of thing because you can't accept new applications for DACA, but the people that are sort of grandfathered in, that survived a number of court tests under the previous administration. So I don't think that the individuals currently in DACA status have too much to worry about. But again, I wouldn't put them behind them. I think the people that are more vulnerable, and you sort of hit on this, is the TPS. So for those of you that don't know, TPS stands for Temporary Protective Status. Certain countries, when there's natural disasters or war strife, the United States has this mechanism whereby you can remain in the United States. The thing about TPS is it's called temporary, but once you have a TPS designation, for those people that were in the United States in a certain window, they can extend their TPS almost indefinitely. And some of these programs, like for Nicaragua and stuff like that, have been around for decades, right? There's going to be a big push to end TPS. In fact, one of the things I know that the Biden administration is working on in the waning hours of their administration is potentially extending TPS now to buy these people more time to figure out what's going on, so that there's like an automatic extension in there before it can be canceled.
Interesting. Okay, so let's talk about Canada, because
do you want me just to hit on a couple of these questions?
No, I think what we'll do is we'll talk about Canada. A lot of the questions, to be honest, I'll tell you, they're very specific, and we're not going to be able to answer specific questions in this. I would recommend that people contact the office and arrange for proper consultations.
Certainly, there is one here that I think is ubiquitous, and then we can hand it over to Canada. But there's this question about what do we think is going to happen to the TN status, and I do want to just address that. Under the last Trump administration, they renegotiated NAFTA, It's now
The
called the
worst
US.
trade agreement in the history of man, I'm given to
Yes,
understand.
right. And like the net result of it was not much change, except I think you buy our milk now. Anyway,
No, there was no change in the immigration provisions at all.
no changes to immigration. I think that, but the bottom line coming out of that negotiation is it can't be revisited again, I think, until 2036.
2026. 2026.
30, it's 36. I'm pretty sure it's 36.
No, they're talking about doing it now. 2026. That's when it comes up for renewal.
Okay, we'll double check on that for everybody.
Yeah.
I think it is a little bit longer. But as far as people currently in the United States on TN status, I don't really see there to be much of a concern for you being here. When you go for an extension, you might see additional questions regarding intent. The TN has to have that non-immigrant intent quotient to it. It has been certainly something that most adjudicators don't ask too many questions about, but I could see that being a new area of inquiry. So,
Yeah, I think that is what we sort of saw in Trump 1 was there used to be sort of a deferral to the previous adjudications. And if you held the status, the chances are that you are going to get the status again. However, I think that we can expect that that is not the case. Okay. And thank you very much. Jonathan, July 1st, 2026.
oh, so just to clarify one thing, you are there is a novel provision in the USMCA where they allow discussions to start in 2026 because it is the 10-year mark of when it expires in 2036.
Correct.
So I think we were both kind of right on that one.
Okay.
But anyway,
there you go. So
TBD on that.
2026 is when it will come up for discussion.
Yes, they have the ability to start reviewing the provisions now in advance of the expiration in 2036.
Okay. So let's talk about Canada. We've had an inordinate amount of inquiries about Americans wanting to come to Canada. And how do we get to Canada? What's being offered? Is there a special program for us? And the answer is there is no special program. And for those people who are just sort of getting interested in Canadian immigration now, in fact, there's been an inordinate amount of tightening in the last 6 months in Canada. And we can expect that to continue. From a permanent perspective, what happens is the government in October annually sets out its quota for the coming year and how many immigrants it wants to take. And the Liberal government came up with numbers as high as 500,000 people, and that's in all the various categories. They've cut that back by about 20% in the last few months. So we can expect fewer spots on Team Canada, shall we say. So in terms of what is immediately available, it would be a temporary solution, I would suggest. And sort of the easiest one for American citizens is there is a visa available under the Student Work Abroad program, which becomes available in the new year. Now, it is a quoted program. There are only so many available, but basically, any American citizen under 36, so 35 and below, can apply for an open work permit to Canada and get that. And there's no requirement of having employment in place. And this will allow you to come and work in Canada for anyone, whether it be yourself, whether it be a Canadian employer, whether it's to continue with your US employer, but it'll allow you full time to be able to be in Canada for a year. So for people that are interested, that's sort of like the path of least resistance because it is available to anybody. The only proviso in all of these would be people who have medical issues, severe medical issues, and those who have criminal issues. Okay, so in all the categories we're going to discuss, that's an issue. Now, we've been talking about TNs you can come the other way under the Canada-US and Mexico agreement with the job offer in the enunciated occupations, okay? So the key thing, of course, is that you are actually working within those occupations. So you have to have a prearranged job offer, but those work permits are good for 3 years. You get them at the border. It's $150. You have to have an employer in place, though, and you have to be working within one of the enunciated job titles. Now, there is another part of CUSMA that doesn't get looked at a lot, but I wanted to bring to people's attention, and that's sort of the investment option. People are more used to using the e-visa to go to the United States, but the same provisions allow for American citizens who are going to invest in Canada and create employment for Canadians to get work permits for themselves and their family members. So that is an option for people if they are interested in making an investment. But there has to be more than for them to earn a living. It's a substantial investment, and they're going to hire Canadians. Now, one of the things I often throw out as an option are student visas for Americans. And the reason being is if they get accepted to a Canadian university or college, they can make those applications at the border, and they're very fast. Although there have been some changes, that's one of the tightening areas. If you are accepted, getting a student visa is a good option. You can work 20 hours a week while you're a full-time student, full-time when you're not a student, and it works very nicely. Like I said, you can get these at the border. You don't need to get them pre-approved. So those are pretty fast. So for people who are interested in getting out, if they get in for the January semester and they're Americans, they can get their study permits at the border. Also applies to green card holders. They can also get the study permits at the border. Now, we're getting a lot of questions about dissent applications. And what I mean by dissent applications are people who have a Canadian parent. Okay, we're getting a lot of questions about Canadian grandparents. Canada allows for citizenship for first generation born abroad. Okay, so they are allowed to automatically claim citizenship that way. Second generation born abroad is more troublesome. Now, there is a court case out there where the government has had to address the issue of subsequent generations born abroad. The regulations have not been finalized yet, but what we've been advised and what's been outlined within the press is that if you are second generation born abroad, you're going to have to show that the first generation born abroad has a close connection to Canada and has spent, we've been told, 3 years in Canada. Then they can pass that on. There has to be a substantial connection test, which is actually sort of similar to the US, I would say, in terms of time spent and how things work in passing on citizenship in the United States. But it's something to consider. Also, obviously, if you have a Canadian spouse or Canadian partner, there's opportunities there to come to Canada, okay? Now, somebody's asked the question about conjugal partnership. A conjugal partnership is a very difficult case to move forward because conjugal partners are only available where you can't get married. If there's an opportunity to be married, you got to get married. So I think in my vast career, I've only done one conjugal partner, and it was where the individual couldn't get a divorce from their home country. And that's how we did them as conjugal. But typically we do them as either married or common law partners. Conjugal is highly unusual. Intra-company transfers, set up a Canadian division of your US company. That allows for easy movement at the border. Now, there have been changes to the intra-company transfer provisions. Doesn't apply to American citizens, but to international people, where you can only do an intra-company transfer to a new office in Canada, where you have 2 international offices. Basically, the thought process is that you have to be a multinational corporation to qualify for this. But right now, the regulation doesn't cover the provisions within CUSMA, the old NAFTA. So you're okay with an American company opening up a division in Canada, you can do a new office, okay?
Evan, can I ask you a little bit about that? Because, on the US side, like the business has to be pretty robust, or they put a lot of like guardrails around what you can and can't do and the duration of visas. How does that work for like setting up something new that doesn't necessarily have like a long track record of operations within Canada?
I would use the strength of the US company to show that. I would show they have to have a Canadian presence. Okay, so they have to have rented an office in Canada. They'd have to have bank accounts in Canada. They'd have to have a corporation in Canada. Things are in place and ready to go, and a business plan. Now, they're border applications, so they're pretty good. Okay, the standard I would suggest to you, we can still do those. Okay. Next question, I want to talk about the Francophone program, because this is sort of an interesting one. Canada has a program that allows for individuals to get work permits pretty easily if they are high functioning in French. Our advice in that regard is, and it has to be outside the province of Quebec. This doesn't apply to Quebec, but everywhere else in Canada, if you have a job offer and you speak French, it doesn't have to be part of the job. French doesn't have to be part of it. You can be, I don't know, lawyer, and you speak French, you can get a work permit. Okay, you just have to have proof of your ability to speak French. If you haven't studied in French, we will probably advise you to take French testing. So you have proof of your French language ability, and you can show that at the port of entry. But it's an interesting program, and it is government policy. They're trying to increase Francophone presence across Canada, and that is government policy. Even within a permanent immigration, the numbers in the express entry system are much lower for French speakers. Because it is government policy. Now, global mobility, individuals who work for large corporations where there's a global mobility program, there is a provision within Canadian immigration. If you can show reciprocality so that there are similarly employed Canadians, you can get a work permit in Canada for those individuals without the necessity of having, for instance, in the intra-company transfer, a year of employment abroad. So we do use the global mobility program for large corporations. A lot of times where people don't get selected, let's say in the H-1B lottery, we'll use that. But it still works for American citizens. And the last sort of real program I want to talk about, which is out there, which I think was a mistake by the government, is this digital nomad visa that they talk about. In reality, they've talked about it. Canada has a digital nomad program. We really don't. All it is saying that you can come to Canada, work for your foreign company for up to 6 months without the necessity of having a work permit. You can always do that as a individual, as a visitor to Canada. So the digital nomad program, although they like to talk about it, really isn't anything other than a visitor's visa to Canada, where you're allowed to stay up to 6 months and you are allowed to work for your foreign company. And that's it. Now, the thing I'm going to say is that things are tightening up in Canada. Okay, they really are. The other thing, and I mean, we haven't seen it so much, but things you can expect in terms of tightening up is, people wanting to come to Canada and work for their foreign company. There's a tax issue there. Are you creating a tax obligation for your company? Okay, and that is something that you need to realize and affect before you make your movement to Canada. So those are sort of the general parameters in terms of Canada. And as I said, in terms of the questions, we can't get to specific questions on your case. call the office and arrange for a consultation, because then we'll have much more time to discuss. Jonathan, is there anything you think companies should be doing now to protect themselves against Trump 2.0?
Well, I think actually Canada is a big part of the solution. I mean that in all sincerity. We saw this last time around. We saw it during 21 and 22 with the hiring frenzy and the lack of H-1B availability. I mean, from a company and individual perspective, let's be very realistic. Like, work does not necessarily always need to be done in the office. Certainly there's preferences, but a lot of jobs are functioning very well in multiple locations and multiple work. Why is that important for US employers? Because this concept of nearshoring, where you can have somebody operating within the same time zone, where you can have somebody who has a secure immigration status, whether it be through I find it funny that you call it CUSMA, by the way, the former NAFTA agreement or an intra-company transferee, and allowing them to provide services to the United States in real time and real clients is an advantage that the Canadian immigration structure
Well,
has
it's
been
interesting
using.
because I talked about the new regulations for the intra-company transfers.
Yeah,
They've said that that is specifically not a valid reason for somebody to be transferred. We've always had the advice that you can't work 100% remotely as an intra-company transferee. That's always been our
interesting.
advice.
Well, but
Because the,
Evan, I wasn't necessarily, and I get that what you're saying, like just setting up in like a home office. I'm more saying if you have an office in Canada and the person is remoting in or
yeah,
providing services to a United States client or related company entity, that is something to put into your consideration bucket.
no, for sure. So what happened was in the intra-company transfer provisions, what they said was you can't, like, they never came up with, there was never a policy regarding hybrid and work from home and any of these things. Okay, there was no policy. It was sort of out in the floating in the air. And our advice to clients was always, you have to have an office. You must have an office, because if you don't and somebody is working 100% remotely, why do they need to be in Canada?
Well, yeah,
And
there has to
the
be.
regulation that came out specifically said, if your reason for working remotely is because you need to be in the same time zone as the United States or in Canada, that is not a valid reason to be working remotely and to be in North
Fascinating.
America.
Yeah, that's
Okay?
fascinating. And it makes sense. I mean, frankly, like we have like physical presence requirements for L
Hmm.
visas, intercompany transferees as well. And frankly, just like, and I always tell this to people, like, it is one thing to tick all the boxes on an application, but if the story doesn't make sense, you're going to have problems. And that is going to be even more so with the Trump administration.
For sure. I
But
always say the people in the first go round, the officers that were difficult have been told to be even more difficult.
yeah, and that goes to like the refereeing and the, but to answer your question, like what can US employers do? I think incorporating Canada into your strategy for your foreign national staff and the way you look at growth and development of your enterprise is something that needs to be seriously considered. And I do highly recommend that. I think on the other side of it, one of the easiest things to do is get your worksite compliance squared away to make sure that your I-9s, and I-9 is the form you fill out. It's the employee verification form to show that somebody has status. Make sure that those are up to date, that they're accessible. If you're hiring foreign nationals already, Evan, there's this thing called the public access file.
Right.
Um, make sure your public access files are up to date. So I think if you're talking about what can I prepare now, we got a good 3-month window to the day of, 2-month window to
Yeah.
the day of really being able to get some of your ducks in a row as far as your compliance things are oriented, and I would highly recommend that. I would just really, really like to stress that just because it's going to be harder doesn't mean it's going to be impossible. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the big difference between Trump the first time around and Trump this time around is, I know somebody commented like 1.7% is not a mandate. It is as substantial in the United States as far as the popular vote goes, but a lot more mainstream businesses and a lot more mainstream business people are supporting the Trump administration than they did in the past. And I think that emphasis on commerce is going to help buoy a lot of the fears that employers have regarding access to foreign national talent, as long as it's operating within the existing programs. I think you're going to need to be more pragmatic. Frankly, if you know that you're going to be having a hiring increase and you know that you're going to have a certain amount of the population that are going to be foreign nationals, start that process sooner. Don't wait.
Let me ask you a
So
question. If I'm
yeah,
if I'm on a work visa in the United States, how early can I apply for that renewal? If I want to apply now and not wait, like let's say I expire next July, can I apply now?
you can only file 6 months in advance of your expiration for most visa classifications, unless there's a basis for an amendment, like a change in job or work location.
So that's the advice. If you can apply within 6 months, if you're expiring within 6 months, apply now, right?
Yeah, I think, and frankly, we are busier than we've ever been for that exact reason. A lot of people that have been on like say a TN visa, but they have a US partner or they're married to a US citizen, they're either getting married or filing those marriage cases now and getting those in. Um, the more protections that you can put in for yourself, the better. And certainly looking at renewals is a good thing, or talking to your employer about commencing a green card process. Like if you want that stability and that's important to you, better to give yourself as much time and optionality as possible.
Yeah. I mean, we did see in Trump 1.0 a surge in companies opening up here. And in 2017, the government here introduced the Global Skills Strategy, which primarily is an IT program, but it has been expanded, which allowed for easier movement of new employees into Canada.
I
And
remember
it's
that
still
one.
there. It's
I
still
remember that
there.
one.
Now, things are getting more difficult in Canada, but once again, like you said, Canada is an option. Companies should be looking to Canada, especially for their foreign nationals who are quite concerned about what's going on. Canada is a good option. It really is. And that's what we saw last time. So we would recommend that. Um, what else do you want to say, Jonathan?
I Yeah, it's a really I would say that the other aspect of it, and we haven't really spoken about this too much, but it has been asked about a little bit. Um, the border side of things is going to get more challenging. When you're crossing the border, expect more queries. And I know we talked about the southern border, but I'm talking about the northern border here. Places like Pearson's, which are already like our stressful encounters just due to the volume, are going to become more stressful. Certain officers are feeling more emboldened.
For sure.
And, I can give you a hyperbolic example, but the day after the election, I had an individual who was coming in on an E1, which is a treaty trader. He had his brother, who's a Canadian citizen who doesn't have a visa. Now, mind you, this guy was not acting in like fully the right way, but his brother was coming in to help him with some trade activities, like a trade show. And they pulled the car over at one of the New York border crossings. The brother says, "I'm here to work." That was a mistake, but
Work is a four-letter word at the
work
border.
is a four-letter word. But Evan, what was interesting is the supervisor on duty, who was clearly feeling empowered by the election, decided rather than refusing admission to charge the driver with the E1 with trafficking an undocumented foreign national.
There you go.
That is like a heavy, heavy, heavy result. Normally, if they don't think you're coming in for the right purpose, they say, come back, send you away. And I
Withdraw.
know it's a little bit of a hyperbolic example, but this individual now has a court hearing for just having somebody in a passenger seat who was supposedly coming into work.
Mm.
So I think you have to be prepared. And honestly, they can smell when you're doing something that's not inappropriate. I mean, if you're coming in as a visitor and you're saying you're coming for a couple of months, unless you're taking a residency in Boca and have a 3-month rental, like be prepared to show an
Yeah,
itinerary.
but even that, I would say to you, unless you're like 60 and above, you're going to be questioned on that. The 35-year-old going down to Miami for the season, problematic.
Yeah, I mean, you're gonna have to document these things, and if you're coming in for longer work trips, having itineraries, showing what you're doing, where you're coming is gonna be critical. If you're showing up the border and you're applying for a TN application, a job offer is probably not gonna get it done. You're gonna need something explaining why, where, and how, because the scrutiny is going to increase. And I think this is kind of like the constant theme, and this is what we saw with the first Trump administration. Excuse me. You know, it's not that you can't do it. You just have to be more intentional about what you're doing and giving yourself enough time to prepare to do it. There has
No,
to be more strategy. There has to be more planning. And,
knowing how to
um,
answer the questions.
and this is something we do regularly, like prep sessions where we ask common questions and get you familiar with the process and what people are going to ask.
For,
Evan, I don't know if
for
you saw this, but there was like a question here about what's going on with express entry. So maybe you
Yeah, I
want
was
to
going to
touch on
talk
that a
about
little
that.
bit.
Well, in terms of express entry, the numbers have gone through the roof when they're pulling draws. And the draws, as the numbers, like I said at the beginning, they dropped about 20% in terms of how many applicants they're going to take. Having said that, express entry, the numbers have gone through the roof, and it's virtually impossible to qualify unless you have worked in Canada and have a year of Canadian work experience. Now, there are exceptions to that. There are specific draws that they do where the points are lowered. Francophone mobility that I spoke about earlier. As well, there are IT and STEM draws that are done where the points are lowered. As well, there are medical draws, people in the medical field, because Canada has a huge need there. And that's when the points are much more reasonable. But even this week, where we saw a Francophone draw, the numbers were much higher than we have seen in the last few months. So we can expect the numbers to stay high, not drop down. So for people that are interested in express entry, unless you are within one of these niche occupations, it's going to be very difficult without coming to Canada and spending some time here first in order to get your scores up higher in the points-based system. Canada does not have a retiree program. There is no such thing in Canada. That was a program that existed in the early 80s and hasn't existed since. From an investment point of view, really the only program out there is the startup visa. And those are individuals who have a history of working with startups. Canada is looking for innovative entrepreneurs. And we would recommend, if you fall within that field, to reach out for a consultation. Very difficult. There is no investor visa right now. There is no self-employed visa right now. It is not easy right now, is the bottom line of what I wanted to say here. Okay, having said all those things, the one thing I can say to you, to everyone here, is please be careful who you deal with. We want to make sure that you're getting the correct advice. And sometimes, unfortunately, the answer is no. Eve has put up our email addresses. People can email us, and we're pretty good about getting back within a reasonable period of time. And I'd ask people to reach out and for consultations and whatnot. But I wanted to thank everybody for attending, and obviously people have specific questions and queries, and the next few months are going to be interesting. Jonathan, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Evan. And I concur about the advice quotient and who you're trusting and where you're getting your information from. Make no mistake about it, this is going to be a changing landscape. We will have regular updates for the community. We will make ourselves available. And I think we're very fortunate as a firm, Evan, to be able to work on both sides of the border and have expertise in that regard. So, you know, as we kind of talked about for the US employers, the solution is not necessarily within the bounds of the United States. It might include Canada and vice versa. And we're here to provide that support. So I really do appreciate everybody who set this up and speaking with you today, Evan, and look forward to navigating the challenges together.
Thanks, everybody, and have a great afternoon.